Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks again for coming to another one of our TESS seminars. And as you all know, TESS is our Center for Tropical, Environmental, and Sustainability Science here at JCU. It's one of our main research centers focusing primarily on terrestrial and freshwater issues, but not on the ocean, not on the marine issues. It's a real pleasure today to have Professor Rob Ewers here speaking to us. We've known Rob for a long time, going back to his days, I think as a PhD student. He did a PhD with Raphael Diddam, very prominent tropical ecologist that worked on forest fragmentation when he was at the University of Canterbury. Did a very good PhD project there, looking at fragmentation impacts on insects, beetles, and different groups, and dealing with a high diversity, complex system. Did very well with that work. He then went on to do a couple of postdocs. He did a postdoc with me when I was at the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute. And he did a postdoc with Andrew Balmford at the University of Cambridge and Georgina Mace at University College London, two very prominent researchers. So Rob was then hired as a tenure track job at the Imperial College London. If you haven't checked your latest global rankings, I think Imperial's in the top 5 pretty consistently. So fantastic university, and Rob's been doing a lot of things there. He's extremely strong quantitatively. He can do he could be a full-time theoretical modeler. He could easily do that. But he also does a lot of work in the field. And in particular, he's been the director and coordinator of the so-called SAFE project, which is a big project run and sponsored by the Royal Society and has a lot of UK researchers, affiliated researchers working on that. But it's a giant experimental forest fragmentation, forest disturbance project that's going on in Sabah in northern Borneo. SAFE stands for the Stability of Altered Forest Ecosystems. Without too much more ado, I'll just go ahead and introduce or move things on to Rob. I think he's probably got the record for the shortest title we've ever had in a TESS talk, 2 words. See if somebody can get a 1-word title in here somewhere. But anyway, it's a real pleasure to have you here, Rob. Thanks very much for joining us. Rob Ewers.
Thanks so much, Bill. I really appreciate that. And thanks for inviting me. I was a bit sorry I can't be there in person. I love Cairns. I've got an uncle who lives there. I've been to visit a few times. And I would much rather be there in person rather than sitting here in England where it's miserable and raining outside. Anyway, so as Bill said, I'm a tropical ecologist, but as he also said, I haven't always been one. I am from New Zealand. As he said, I did my PhD here in the beautiful Lewis Pass in the Southern Alps of the South Island, looking at forest fragmentation impacts on beetle communities, including a lot of work on these carabid beetles. And this was all happening in what I consider to be the most enchanting type of forest that I've come across still. These are southern beech forests, and they are extraordinary. The forest canopy here is almost completely monodominant, and it's a very short stature canopy. It's only about 15 to 20 meters tall. And so when I moved from that to the tropics, the difference really gave me quite a hell of a surprise, really. Now, it didn't help that in my imagination, tropical forests were these beautiful green cathedrals that you read about in books. Everyone uses that phrase. And of course, these forests are that. But what I've learned through time is that they're also dark and a muddy swamp. And whatever version of a tropical forest you're working in, though, it's hard work. These forests are hot, they're humid, they sap energy, they're extremely physically demanding and challenging to work in. And then there's all the challenges of dealing with diversity and the fact you just don't know what anything is. And to a large extent, neither does anyone else. So it's really hard to figure out what's going on in a tropical rainforest. But that is a lot of why I enjoy it so much. That complexity I find is a really stimulating challenge. And so today I want to tell you something about what we've managed to figure out, and that is focused on what's happening in the logged and damaged tropical forests, and not the pretty ones that I had in mind when I first went to the tropics. I really mean the crappy ones that most people don't think about that much. So I've been working on forests that look like this for the past decade or more. And the reason is that logged tropical forests are the new norm. So across the global tropics, more than half of all standing forests have been logged, and that proportion is increasing. So if we want to know anything at all about the future of forests, then we need to be emphasizing our study of these degraded ones over those pristine ones. Now, I think perhaps the single most important question we can ask about these forests is how resilient are they? And it's a relevant question for primary as well as damaged forests, but I think particularly pertinent for those damaged ones, because after all, they have been damaged, we can see it. But the question then is, will they recover from that damage? And that's a question about resilience. And if we want to know what the future of our planet's going to be, answering this simple sounding question is really critical. And so that's what this talk is going to be focused on. To start with, though, I want to emphasize that biodiversity in tropical forests is more sensitive to forest damage than biodiversity is in the rest of the world. So this is work I did with Matt Betts using data sets from around the world. And our response variable here is the proportion of species that need core habitat to persist. So these are species that don't like habitat edges or degraded or modified habitats. They need to have large areas of undisturbed habitat. And if you look across studies at a global scale, there's a very strong latitudinal gradient. In the tropics, you have communities that are dominated by these core species. But as you move away from the tropics, you have fewer and fewer of them. And this is a pattern we found that holds for insects, for birds, for frogs, for mammals. It's a really general pattern. And it means that biodiversity in the tropics is more sensitive to land use change than biodiversity in temperate or boreal biomes. Now, in the paper, we went on to make an argument that this is all because of extinction filters, and that the temperate world has either lost those core species already, or they never evolved there because of a history of repeated natural disturbances. Whereas the tropics have largely undisturbed environmental regimes over evolutionary timescales. And on human timescales, they've had relatively few human impacts as well, although that's obviously rapidly increasing. And what it all means is that because all these sensitive species are still out there, which is a good thing, but because they're out there, then we would expect even small changes to tropical forests to have quite dramatic impacts. And this is a pattern we definitely see. So I've seen that happening for the past 15 years or so, working in Borneo, in particular at the SAFE project, which Bill mentioned. So this was set up in 2010. It's a global consortium now. It's got hundreds of researchers involved. And everyone that's worked at SAFE has come in and they've focused their studies on their area of expertise. And it means collectively, if you can name it, someone's probably studied it. And so together we're gaining what I would argue is one of the most comprehensive empirical descriptions of how human modified and how human stressed tropical ecosystems operate. And all of this data, all of this information and knowledge leaves us in a really great place to talk about the status of these logged forests and about their resilience. So to start with, what exactly is the status of logged forests? And this is where big projects like SAFE have an advantage because we have large data sets that let us take quite a comprehensive overview of questions like this. And so I'm going to give you a tale of two halves here. There's a positive half and then there's a negative half. The positive half is all about biodiversity because by and large it thrives in logged forest. These are data for birds and mammals, and we're using just two simple metrics here that tell pretty much the same story. There's a much higher density of biomass and either equivalent or higher species richness in a logged forest than there is in a primary forest. And that means these forests are massively dynamic environments. So compared to a primary forest, a logged forest has more than double the density of bird biomass and more than triple the density of mammal biomass. And of course, all those individual animals contributing that biomass are all out there eating stuff, and they're eating a lot of stuff. So these bubbles here show the amount of energy being consumed by the various vertebrate groups, and those bubbles are much larger in logged than in primary forests. Which is telling us those logged forests is a far more energetically dynamic environment. And the main thing to point out here is that it's all about the birds, which is something I'd never realized. Birds have only about 1/3 of the biomass that mammals have, but birds are accounting for more than 2/3 of the total energy flow in both of these systems, primary forest and logged forest. And within the birds, it's dominated by the insectivores, insect eaters, which shows up really well on this figure. So the y-axis here is the annual energy consumption of birds and mammals separately divided into categories according to what they're eating. By far, the largest amount of energy flow is pumping up through insectivorous birds, the yellow portion on that left-hand histogram. And so birds en masse are driving much more of the energy flows through the ecosystem than the mammals. And yeah, I've been blind to the importance of birds for about 20 years of my career as a forest ecologist. And it's ridiculous because I know there's a lot of them out there. They are the most common animal you see, but I never quite understood why that matters or why it's important. But it turns out it really does matter because there's a lot of birds out there. And individually, they might weigh next to nothing, but because they all have such small body sizes, of course, they have very high metabolic rates. And so that means birds are really out there driving the energetics of an entire forest ecosystem. But to dive into this a bit deeper, I do want to make the point that not all logged forests are created equal. So it's visually apparent some are more heavily impacted than others. Just looking at photos like these shows it. Both of these forests have been logged. One you can definitely see it, and one you really can't see it so much. But that variation really strongly influences the magnitude of the logging impacts we detect. And that's strongly reflected in our data, and it's going to become quite an important theme of this talk. So this is a manuscript that's on its way out soon and that brings together a lot of different variables organized across 4 ecological levels. There's basic habitat structure, followed by the traits of the tree communities, then diversity of plant and animal communities, and at the highest level comes things like ecosystem processes and functioning. Now, logging impacts pretty much every variable out of the 79 variables we tested in this paper. And this figure, which is buried in the supplement, actually, it only presents a subset of those. But I want to use it to show that logging impacts can happen at 2 different points. So first, it can happen when you go from being a primary forest to being a logged forest. So these are the green bars. Variables here with long green bars have most of their variance explained by that simple categorical difference between primary and logged forests, irrespective of how light or heavy the logging was. But then there's also a whole lot of variables that are also impacted by variation in logging intensity, which is the orange parts of the bars. So these variables are better explained by variation in logging intensity rather than that simple fact of whether logging has occurred or not. Because for these variables, logged forests are not all equal. They vary a tremendous amount. And that strongly impacts the state of the system. And here's a specific example of how that logging intensity matters. In a primary forest, you will never see an invasive black rat because they are not there. But the more heavily you log that forest, the more likely you are to see them. So in other words, logging a forest opens it up to invasive species like this rat. And we've seen exactly the same pattern for invasive species of plants as well. So it seems quite general. And it means the intensity of logging, so the extent to which a forest gets damaged, exerts really strong control over the biodiversity impacts that are realized. But of course, we care about our forests for more than just biodiversity. And carbon is another obvious facet that has very high importance. And this is a less positive story. We invested huge amounts of money quantifying all the major stocks and flows of carbon in primary and logged forests, which is all summarized here in one complicated figure. And buried in this figure is a big difference in carbon balance between the 2 types of forest, which I'll highlight in a moment. But first, let me give you the take-home message, which is that primary forests in green are carbon neutral. So their net ecosystem exchange is 0. But the logged forests in brown are a definite source of carbon to the atmosphere. Those logged forests emit more carbon than they suck in. And what's more, the more heavily logged those forests are, moving along the brown bars from the left out to the right, then the more carbon you're emitting. This really runs counter to a standard narrative that logged forests are great carbon sinks. Our data from SAFE is the first to quantify that full carbon budget inside logged forests. It shows the opposite. It shows that logged forests, even a decade or more after logging, they are carbon sources rather than sinks. And we know why this is the case. Logged forests have much more coarse woody debris that's left over from the logging. So it's all the branches that were stripped off the trunk and left behind, the root balls left in the ground, and all of that has to rot away. So there's a lot more carbon emissions going on from dead wood in a logged forest than there is in a primary forest, twice as much as it happens. And we know it's taking well over a decade, multiple decades, before that process is going to equilibrate and these carbon balances might come back to being neutral again. It's only when you go past that point that you might start seeing a logged forest get that net positive carbon balance that we want and that we hope to see in our logged forests that are recovering. So there's a mixed set of messages about the status of logged forests. On the one hand, they're brilliant for animals. Vertebrates really benefit a great deal. But log forests are not equal. If you log too much, you can do things like invite invasive species in. On the other hand, those logged forests have a negative carbon balance, not the positive one we generally assume. And so I think there is a middle line here, though, which is that a bit of logging probably isn't that bad. So a bit of selective, low intensity, reduced impact logging can probably be done in a way which is possibly carbon neutral and probably biodiversity positive, depending on your metric. I do think that's an achievable goal. So that was the state of the forest. Now let's move on to something which is a bit more esoteric, the title of this talk. It's more difficult to quantify, and that's probably about the resilience of these forests. At the scale of Borneo, I am absolutely confident that forests are losing resilience because we can measure that directly. Now, my master's student, Shuji Chang, has done this just recently by looking for a signal of critical slowing down in satellite data of vegetation optical depth, so a metric of forest structure and vegetation density. And it gets measured monthly, and it has been for a number of decades now. And there's a big theoretical and experimental literature that demonstrates how critical slowing down is a precursor to a system suddenly changing state. And so in the Amazon, we talk about forests turning into savanna, for example, as a change of state. And we can detect critical slowing down using satellite imagery, looking for changes in lag1 autocorrelation, which is what the y-axis here, a measure of temporal autocorrelation in that satellite imagery through time. And over the last decade or more, 2 decades, since 2004, there's been a consistent increase in the strength of that lag1 autocorrelation. So any positive slope on this figure of autocorrelation through time indicates critical slowing down, and it indicates a loss of resilience. And it's pretty clear then that this is a real phenomenon. And that change isn't evenly spread across the island of Borneo. So what we've found is a potential connection with biodiversity itself. So it is a very indirect connection. I'm quite happy to say that. It's not direct by any means, but we do find we have higher lag1 autocorrelation. So we have reduced resilience in places with fewer species. And we also found that the rate at which resilience is being lost has been considerably larger in those areas with fewer species as well. So areas with lower biodiversity appear to be less resilient to start with, and what resilience they do have is being lost at a faster rate. Now, that study is the most direct measure of resilience that I've been able to deliver, and we're working on that towards a publication now. But it is a little abstract as well. It's based on seasonal changes in vegetation density and really big grid squares. So we can't explore much about how and why resilience might be changing. We can't do really direct connections to biodiversity, for example. To do that, to work out exactly how and why resilience is being lost, we need to use other methods. And that means we're looking more at proxies of resilience rather than direct measures of resilience itself. So here I'm going to make an argument that resilience is all about ecosystem functions. It's not about whether species X manages to keep a healthy population size. Rather, it's about whether the ecological processes that species X contributes to are maintained. So it's about the species that are out there doing what those species are meant to do, like this happy little pill beetle here rumbling along at its happy little speed. And what we've found is the resilience described in this way is all about the small things. It's all about invertebrates. So Louise Ashton showed this work really well when her team conducted a project at SAFE. This is nothing to do with me, they were just doing it at SAFE. And they demonstrated how termites make the forest more resilient to drought. So they did this during the 2015-2016 El Nino event when the forest went into drought. Rivers were drying up. And in some cases, they dried up completely. We had to close our camp, for example. Everyone got evacuated because the water supply was gone. Now, on the forest floor, termites, which were always there, increased their activity rates. So they weren't more abundant, but they were more active. And that did three things to the forest. It accelerated the speed of litter decomposition, it kept the soil moist, and it moved key nutrients around the forest floor, things nitrate, ammonia, calcium, potassium, iron, manganese, aluminium, the works, that were all getting distributed around the forest floor much more efficiently. And those three actions together meant tree seedlings were more likely to survive the drought if termites were present than if termites were absent. So it's showing that termites make that process of forest regeneration resilient to really severe drought. Now, this particular experiment was conducted in primary forest. It wasn't in the logged forest. So we don't know for sure if this particular process is being protected by termites in the same way in those more degraded forests. But we do know from work by Sarah Luke that termite density in logged forests is less than 1/3 of what it is in the primary. So the expectation is that probably those logged forests are going to be less resilient than the primary forests. It also suggests that the invertebrate contribution to forest resilience is going to be weakened. And this is a hypothesis which we have gone out to test directly. And what we've tried to find out is whether the things a forest does, if they happen at more or less the same speed in logged forest as they do in primary forest. And on that metric, by and large, logged forests seem to be pretty resilient, actually. So the rate at which leaves decompose, for example, is about the same in primary and logged forests. That's important because that, of course, is what controls how fast nutrients are cycling through the forest. The rate at which seeds are picked up and moved around by animals is slightly higher in logged than in primary forest, as you might expect, given I've already said there's more vertebrates out there. That, of course, is important. Those seeds have to be dispersed across the landscape if the forest is going to regenerate itself. And a third example, the rate at which insects get eaten, again, is roughly the same in primary and logged forest. There's no significant differences between these rates. And this matters because it's a form of pest control. So it stops things like caterpillars getting out of control and just stripping that forest canopy bare. So by and large, pivotal ecosystem processes do appear relatively resilient to logging. But I showed before that invertebrates, the example of the termites, are central to ensuring the resilience of the forest. Now, when we've looked deeper, what we've found is a worrying sign that insect control of that forest is being eroded. And as insects get kicked off their throne, With them goes the resilience of the forests. And we can see that by looking in more detail at just one of these ecosystem processes, that pest control one. And first looking at what's going on in primary forest. So here vertebrates, things like birds and rodents and so on, they only account for about 5% of the predation of insects, which is happening. So not very much. Compare that to predatory insects, mostly ants, but doing far more, far more. And so it shows that in primary forests, ants are our dominant predator of invertebrates, and with good reason, because they're everywhere and they are voracious predators. These are fire ants tackling a cockroach here. But our data shows that their dominance might be coming to an end, because if we do that exact same experiment in logged forest, two things change. First, vertebrates are doing much more, so the dark bar is longer. And second, insects are doing much less than they did in the primary forest. That light bar is shorter. And even more surprising, vertebrates are now doing more than the invertebrates. And this pattern turns out to be true for all of the ecosystem processes looked at. So most of the vertebrates that are doing this job in logged forest are also present in the primary forest, but they're just not doing that much. They're redundant. So they're out there, those vertebrates. They're flashy, they're glamorous, they make great tourist photos. Just not necessarily that important, because in the primary forest, it's all about the beetles and the ants and the termites and the worms. And that redundancy is really important in a forest ecosystem. If one species stops doing the job, redundancy means there's another species on hand to pick it up. It's a type of insurance policy. And it's that redundancy that's ensured these vital ecological processes keep happening in logged forest. And that's why the forest has been so resilient to logging damage. The flip side of that coin, of course, is that that redundancy has now been drawn down on. So it's a reasonable expectation that any further changes to a logged forest are likely to see them hit strife. So while I think I'm confident in saying logged forests are resilient, the mechanism underpinning that resilience has been weakened. And that is something to worry about, because of course logged forests don't get left alone. Now, there's one more really intriguing pattern I've picked up on that might be further contributing to the resilience of these forests. And most ecologists are at least vaguely aware of discussions around diversity stability effects and how having more species should make a more stable ecosystem. And that pattern is driven by having redundancy in your ecosystem functions like I've just described. But it only works if your different species respond to logging in different ways, which I've indicated is the case, for example, for invertebrates versus vertebrates. But what if even a single species can respond to logging in different ways at different times? And on the surface, that sounds like a properly daft thing to say, but actually we've found this is real, and not just real, this is common. So I'll give you an example. This is the dung beetle, Onthophagus muelleri, and we've found it all across SAFE. It's just over a centimetre long. It flies around during the day, sniffing out fresh poo. When it finds it, it tunnels beneath that dung pile, buries some of that dung, lays their eggs on the dung, and then moves on. Now, the first time we looked at it, Onthophagus muelleri responded strongly to logging damage. By and large, it's pretty impervious little critter. You have to cut down more than 60% of your tree biomass. It's a massive logging intensity before you get any impact on the probability of Onthophagus muelleri being out there. But once you go past that threshold of forest damage, the probability of them persisting drops very rapidly indeed. But then we analysed it in another survey from another year, and it did something completely different. Hardly there at all, but when you did find it, this dung beetle preferred the more heavily damaged forests. And that pattern held across a third survey. It got stronger in a fourth survey, but in the fifth survey, it reversed again, started preferring primary forests again, which we then found again in the sixth survey. So we've basically got the same species responding to the same logging gradient at the very same place, but responding in completely different ways in different years and in different data sets. And it's not just one species of dung beetle doing this sort of thing, it's common. So this figure shows the proportion of species that have consistent responses to logging damage year after year. So these are species that respond to logging in exactly the same way every single time we see them. And across all of these taxa, we're only talking about 40% of species that do this. More than half, so 60% of the taxa we analyze are not consistent. Their response to logging damage changes year on year. Usually not in as extreme form as Onthophagus muelleri, but still getting statistically different responses to logging damage in different years for any given species is the norm, not the exception. And why I think this matters is because there's a big literature showing how having different species in a community that respond to environmental change in different ways contributes to the stability of that system en masse. And what we're seeing here, I think, is an extension of that phenomenon, because now even the same species can respond differently to the same environmental change. And those flexible, those annually changing responses mean things at species level are quite variable, but at system level, things are probably quite good. So I can't unequivocally link these patterns to forest resilience in a direct manner, but I do think there's enough theoretical connections being developed in the literature to make it a reasonably robust conclusion that having flexible responses of individual species to that forest damage is going to help further contribute to a resilient environment. All right, so I've slowly been building an argument that invertebrates are central to keeping forests in a resilient state, but I've also said, or at least inferred, that invertebrates are the group which is suffering the most in logged forests. Vertebrates seem to love it, but not so great for invertebrates. So what exactly is it then that's inhibiting the ability of invertebrates to do their job in damaged forests? And I think it all boils down to thermal physiology. So in this experiment, we put ants in a test tube. We heated them up until they fell over to find out the maximum temperature they can tolerate, their CT max. And it varies a lot among genera. Some lose their ability to walk at relatively low temperatures of around 40 degrees Celsius. Others function right up until about 48 degrees. And these physiological differences have a strong impact on your ability to succeed in a logged forest. So if you like it hot, so you have a high CT max, you tend to get more abundant in a logged forest than you are in a primary forest. So you have values on this figure which are greater than 0. If you can only take it cold though, so you have a low CT max, then you tend to lose out. These are primary forest species that struggle in the logged forest. And the moral of the story is that not all species are physiologically able to prosper in a logged forest. They might still be there, but they're in lower numbers, which means they're doing less stuff. Now, this particular result doesn't look massively strong. It isn't massively strong. It's explaining 20-odd% of the variance in the data. But that is actually a huge proportion, given that logged forests aren't that much hotter than a primary forest. They're only 1 to 2 degrees Celsius hotter. In fact, and only that much hotter for a couple of hours of the day when temperatures are the highest. So it's a really minimal difference in terms of the environmental temperatures, and yet it's still explaining 20% of the impact of logging on ant abundance. And that is far more variation than we were able to explain using things like body size and feeding habits and nesting habits and morphology and all your standard basket of morphological and physical traits. And it's even more powerful than what it seems, because most invertebrates, of course, never experience what we scientists measure and call microclimate. Instead, invertebrates are experiencing the temperature at the boundary layer, right on the surface and just a few millimeters above the surface they're foraging on. And those temperatures get really, really hot. So ambient temperature, as we call it on this figure, that's the temperature in the shade under the forest, our typical measure of microclimate. And it's pretty much insensitive to the amount of canopy cover you have. But what the insects are experiencing in these forests with low canopy cover is really extreme because ground surface temperatures get up into the range of 40 to 50 degrees Celsius, which is really very uncomfortably hot and outside the operating window of almost all of the species event we were looking at. So if you line up those surface temperatures with the CT max events, you start seeing how their ability to deliver functions might be getting impaired. So this figure shows that provided you have 75% of canopy cover in place, then everything's probably fine. If you have that much canopy cover, ants can access all of the forest floor. But as soon as you start reducing canopy cover below that, you start getting parts of the forest floor that ants just can't exploit because it's too hot. And predictably, that situation gets worse the further you go into the future. And as climate change intensifies, which is the different lines here, the blue is under present day conditions, where already there's as much as 10% of the forest floor that ants can't access in those most heavily degraded forests. And it means that 3 or 4 decades from now, those yellow and gray lines, realistic climate scenarios, in those situations, ants may not be able to forage on as much as 1/4 of the forest floor in really heavily logged forests, which is a massive reduction to their activity and to the amount of ecosystem function they're going to be able to deliver. And by the way, this isn't just ants we're talking about. It's a whole suite of invertebrates. We've shown the same pattern for dung beetles, for non-dung beetles. We can show it for termites, for moths, and also, not that anyone particularly cares about the ecosystem functions of a leech, but we've shown it for leeches as well. And for all of them, their thermal physiology is a critical predictor of their ability to keep logged forest ecosystems functioning. So what can we do then to minimize that threat? One of the main messages so far has been that not all logged forests are created equal. And that variation matters a great deal for biodiversity, for the carbon status, and also for the resilience of logged forests. So then where can we draw the line? How much can you log before you cross a threshold and start exerting irreparable damage? And this is a question which I had to grapple with for quite a few years before I found like I was able to put a defensible answer onto it. So what I did was compile all the data from SAFE that I could get. So that was presence-absence data on the occurrences of almost 1,700 different taxa across the tree of life. I was able to allocate those taxa to 129 different functional groups, covering things like 6 trophic levels, 21 diet categories, metrics of habitat use, body size, movement mode, and so on. So a whole lot of information about what these species do, where they are, and how they act in their environment. And I boiled it down to very simple binomial GLM of presence-absence data. So as a predictive variable, I'm using a single metric of logging intensity, which is how much biomass has been removed from the system. And SAFE encompasses data from every point along this gradient. So we're in a really great position to make judgments about how far you can push things before they break. So I've fitted this GLM separately for nearly 1,700 taxa for 129 functional groups. And I've used derivatives to extract 2 summary metrics. So the first is a change point. This is the point at which we can first detect a change in your occurrence pattern. So the very first signal that logging is definitely changing something. And I'm able to get 1,700 different estimates of where this change point lies. And so if you lump all of those together, it gives me a distribution of how the change points are spread across the logging intensity gradient. And it looks like this. So basically, there is no level of forest degradation that was too small to have an impact on biodiversity. So there's a huge peak of taxa that pass a change point, meaning logging is impacting their pattern of occurrence. It happens very early on with absolutely minimal amounts of biomass loss. And so this is really echoing our earlier global analyses, showing that tropical taxa are very, very sensitive to very small amounts of forest disturbance. After that early peak, though, the rate at which taxa are passing tipping points really tails off. until you've got the very heavily damaged forests, at which point there's another suite of taxa that start getting impacted. So these are the real survivors. They're doing largely fine through most of that hammering the forest is being given, and they only get impacted right at the very end. Now, the second point on this curve that I'm interested in is the point along the gradient where your rate of change in occurrence is the highest. So this is where very small amounts of additional biomass loss can have very large impact on your occurrence pattern. And this is the distribution showing where those maximum rate points sit for functional groups. And at low levels of logging, there's not many groups that have rapid rates of change. But the number of taxa having those rapid rates of change does start increasing as you start pushing up past about 30% of biomass loss. But it doesn't really accelerate until you go past about 2/3 of biomass loss. And so if I overlay these two figures, we get some pretty useful insight into our question about how far we might push these forests. So the open circles you've seen on these lines show the acceleration points along these density curves. So these indicate points where things start to get worse. So the rate at which impacted taxa or functional groups are accumulating starts to accelerate. And that first acceleration point happens at around 30% biomass loss in both cases. That's when the first big impact of logging on the individual taxa has already been realized, but it's before the peak rate of change in most of those functional groups has happened. So it's suggesting that before this threshold, the functional groups are still largely intact. So the individual taxa within those groups have been impacted, but they haven't yet been heavily impacted. So that means that any damage that's been done to the forest should probably be able to repair itself, provided we leave the forest alone. Because all of those groups doing all of those functions are still largely okay. And so that basic forest resilience, I think, should be intact until at least this point of around 30% biomass loss. But there's also a secondary peak at around 2/3 of biomass loss. This is where further damage again starts to exert an extra round of impact. And that's much less relevant to my central question, though, which was about how much logging is too much logging. And these data, I think, give a reasonable answer to that. They suggest we can remove as much as 1/3 of the biomass before we really start impairing the forest's ability to look after itself. And that is, I think, a surprisingly large number. And it is a good news number because it suggests we can potentially extract quite a lot of resource from a tropical forest before we start causing it serious harm. Okay, so to finish up this talk, I just want to change tack one last time, and introduce you to the main project I'm working on at the moment, and that is again targeted at understanding resilience. It's called the virtual ecosystem, and it's about taking very fundamental principles of physiology, organismal physiology, and using those to take the forest out of the forest and replicate all of those dynamics inside a computer. So we are using allometry to tell us the metabolic rate of all individual organisms in the forest, not just vertebrates, invertebrates, trees, plants, even down to soil microbes. And we combine that with stoichiometry, so that balance of carbon to nitrogen to phosphorus, which can then tell us how much of each nutrient that individual needs to find and consume on any given day, if it's going to survive, if it's going to grow, if it's going to reproduce. And then we use known feeding relationships to tell us where that individual is going to get those nutrients from. And what we end up with is a dynamic equilibrium, which is taking just very basic rules of organismal physiology. And it's taking a known pattern of who eats who at functional group level. And from that, all of the demographic dynamics and all of the species interactions that together define a rainforest just naturally emerge. In using this approach, we think we can simultaneously close the loops of 5 key cycles in a forest. So that's energy, water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And we're simultaneously replicating population demographics, so birth rates, growth rates, death rates, population sizes of all of those individual functional groups in the forest. So it's everything pretty much, going from soil microbes and plants through to ants and orangutans. And we're able to simulate this at the scale of individual organisms using organismal physiology as the key. And the reason for doing this is to let us better understand forest resilience. So the idea is to run virtual experiments in the virtual ecosystem. So things that just aren't feasible in real world systems. So for example, cutting the connections between different taxa to see if that alters stability, or targeting disturbances at specific taxa to see how that disturbance propagates through the system, how rapidly the system can recover. So I'm really excited about this project. We're at the point where we have very nearly finished doing the bit we always knew we could do, which is code the simulation itself. But now we're just starting to set out on that process of calibrating it, which is kind of the moment of truth for a simulation of like this. We know we can code the processes, but whether that combination of processes makes sense and gives reasonable outputs is all down to the calibration process, which we're just starting now. So it's going to be a really fun time. It's going to be a really interesting period over the next 3 to 5 months when we figure out whether our last 2 or 3 years of coding has paid off or not. Touch wood, watch this space. Okay, but then let me just summarize the case I've been putting to you. And it is mostly, I think, mostly a positive case. Logged forests, I think, are better than most people probably think. They are more biodiverse, they are more dynamic, and they're more resilient than we tend to give them credit for. On top of that, I think we can use our forests quite productively. I think we can extract a surprisingly large amount of resource from them before we start to seriously impair their ability to function as a forest, or before we start to really generate significant harm. And so while I do think there are still significant gaps in our understanding of the extent to which the mechanisms that underpin forest resilience might be getting eroded, I can say that it's got a whole lot to do with the physiology and the functions of invertebrates, and that it's the little things, not the big showy things like this monitor lizard, but it's the little things which are really central to safeguarding the future of modified forests. So let me wrap up by very briefly drawing attention to the hundreds of colleagues I've worked with at SAFE over the past 15 years. They're not all here, obviously. It's more than's going to fit onto a slide, but it has been an incredible set of people. And all I've really done for this talk is stitch together their insights and their data into a single narrative. Of course, it's expensive, but I've had amazing support, particularly from Sime Darby Foundation and more recently from Nomus Foundation for supporting the virtual ecosystem project. And now I will leave it here with a picture of some of the little things, some harvestmen that not many people pay attention to. But if you go around these forests, these tropical forest harvestmen are everywhere. And so they probably are quite important. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Really happy to take questions.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks very much. Questions? Anybody? Yeah. Dennis?
Thanks for your talk, Rob. I lived in Malaysia for 3.5 years. I know the country pretty well. I'm just back from Malaysia, actually. I came back on Sunday night from Sabah and Sarawak. Really interesting stuff you're saying, but I suppose there's a sort of a deep elephant there, you know, plodding its way through the room, which you really haven't mentioned, which is oil palm. Now, in the 1980s, and when I lived there, that forest was widespread, it was dense, and I take your point. As a birder, I'm also the convener of BirdLife Australia, Far North Queensland, that when you diminish a forest, you can get a proliferation of particularly bird life. We know that the insect eaters love that habitat in a fragmented forest. But I suppose what you're saying is only really in relation to forests that are logged for the logging industry. But you haven't really mentioned those cleared forests, for palm. And, you're talking about graded forests as if it's the whole, but vast percentages of that are completely cleared into a monoculture. And we know that some species do survive in palm oil. Civets do very well. Some species of birds are doing quite well. But we know that our hornbills, which is a particular fancy of mine, and on the Kinabatangan River, I was very pleased to see 7 species still holding up in Kinabatangan, which is amazing. But they do need vast territories, particularly helmeted, wrinkled, wreathed, and of course rhinoceros. They need about 60 square kilometers to manage their habitat within that viable population of around 50 pairs. And I just don't see how what you're doing is going to address that big elephant in the room, which is the issue around palm oil. We talk about sustainable palm oil, but that's basically no new palm. The palm oil that's still being produced is clearing totally. It's not a fragmented forest. It's a forest that is completely removed. And I sort of worry a little bit about what aspect of the forest you're really referring to and to what extent you're addressing that big elephant in the room, which is palm oil and the palm oil industry. I'm sorry for my long commentary, but it is a rather pressing matter to all of us who care about biodiversity.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. Oil palm is a huge, huge issue. This talk was not ever designed, and the research I've been presenting was not designed to understand impacts of conversion of a forest to an oil palm. It is very much about the forests which is still out there, and there are still a lot of forests out there which are escaping that conversion. The converted ones, they're not a lost cause. Palm oil obviously has a terrible rap, and rightly so. It's a major driver of deforestation. But at the same time, I think we should keep that in a bigger perspective, because oil palm is incredibly productive. So if you have 1 hectare of oil palm, you might be getting away by not needing 6 or 10 hectares of soybean, for example. And if you've been in a soybean plantation, it's a knee-high annual cover crop, which gets put back to bare dirt every year. Oil palm plantations are a tree crop. You yourself mentioned there is some species which do all right in it in a way which never happens in soybean. So it's a sacrifice, but by having an oil palm, you're converting less area to forest than would otherwise be needed to meet global demand for vegetable oil, and you're having a less strong biodiversity impact per hectare than you would be having from alternative oil crops. So it's a bit of a conflicting message again. I'm certainly not advocating the expansion of oil palm. I don't think it's a great thing. But in context, I think it's a better thing than the alternatives. In terms of what we are doing, we do have work with them. The virtual ecosystem project that I'm talking about has an element to that, which is working directly with an oil palm research institute in Kuala Lumpur, Applied Agricultural Researchers. They've seconded one of their staff members to our project for a couple of years to just see if the sorts of methods we're developing can be used to try and better manage the environmental sustainability of those plantations. Because the problem there is that we're preaching to the converted. We're basically preaching to companies which have already signed up to RSPO. And by and large, those aren't the ones doing the deforestation anymore. Historically, they might have been, now they're constrained. But it's the companies which haven't signed up, and it's the small to medium-sized companies for whom that paperwork burden of signing up to something like RSPO is just not worth it. It's such a massive hassle. Those are the ones which are doing the damage. I have absolutely no idea how you reach those groups and how you can work with them. But the ones that are signed up to these sustainability commitments, some of them probably greenwashing it. Some of them, I am convinced, do it for the right reasons because they do actually care about long-term sustainability. By and large, I think that follows company ownership. The ones which are in long-term family ownership tend to care more about long-term sustainability than the ones which are in public ownership. But there are ways, I think, to improve the sustainability and the biodiversity on oil palm plantations. But as you say, it is never, ever going to replace a forest. I mean, it can't.
Okay, other questions?
Hi, I had a question. You focused a lot on ants in like the talk you gave today, and I was just wondering, is there a direct link to like what species of ants do the most in terms of forest recycling?
I think I mean, I couldn't tell you offhand what it is, but we have data for that because I had a postdoc early on in SAFE called Tom Fail who spent months and months putting bait cards down on the forest floor and logging which species of ant came and which bait they took and whether they were taking protein from the floor or sugars or carbohydrates and whatever, and how big the pieces of bait were which they were taking. So we have a lot of detailed data which could be used to get that answer.
So from the data you,
Sorry.
so from the data you have, do you like from your like what you've seen, is it just like all ants across the board, or do you think there are specific species in these tropical forest regions that do more?
Well, doing more, I think, is largely just abundance mediated. It's if you've got a big population size or a high local density, then you do more because there's more of you. When it comes to ant functions, my impression is the more we look, the less specialized most species tend to be, not just ants. Ants are quite generalist to start with, but the more we look, the more we find everything doing everything. So for example, the biggest ant out there used to be called Camponotus gigas, but then they changed the genus name. I'm quite sure I've never updated to know what the new one is. That was always described to me as one which foraged in the canopy on honeydew. I've got a student out there at the moment doing carcass decomposition, and it's one of the ones which is coming up, chomping up dead rat carcasses. You know, these ants are doing everything. So my impression is that most ants are reasonably generalist, reasonably opportunistic. If there's a food source there to be had, they'll take it. There's
So it more is
exceptions to
just
that,
along,
but
it more just
generally,
is along the lines of all invertebrates are what you would focus on in that.
that's for ants. I think once you start getting into beetles, you get a bit more specialization.
Okay.
And then you get things like spiders, which are all predators, for example. They become more specialized. So there are big taxonomic differences. The harvestman on this picture is predator, almost certainly. So there are that level, I think there's taxonomic differences. But the other thing which goes unnoticed, which I think is really important to draw attention, is like something like insect predators. They're competing with birds for their food. And you have this cross-taxon redundancy, which a lot of people don't think about because they study ants or they study spiders or they study birds, but they don't study birds and spiders at the same time.
Yeah.
And so I talked a little bit about that change from invertebrate-driven predation to vertebrate-driven. And my wife, Chris Banks-Late, who works in Brazilian Atlantic forests, has seen similar similar things happen in the forests, in the fragmented forests over there, that you can keep your rate of invertebrate predation going, or with a swap from bird-driven predation to insect-driven predation. And so it still keeps those herbivore populations under control, so that herbivory rates on plants are unaffected by things like edge effects, even though you're getting a dropout of birds.
Yeah,
And
well,
and carry on.
I was going to say that's, I guess, why your simulation is such an amazing tool, because you would be able to do all this type of thing with your tool, from what you were saying.
If it works. That's a giant if, but yeah, if it works, that's what we're hoping to be able to do.
It is incredible what you're trying to do there.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. That was really super interesting and made a lot of sense. There's two things I didn't quite get, and I was wondering if you could expand on. One, with the when you had the whole map of Borneo, and I presume it was remote sensing, and you said that it was slowing down or less resilient or something. If you could just explain how you did that, or what you measured, or whatever. And the other thing I was wondering about is where the species that responded differently in different years, what was it about the different years that made them respond differently? Like, was it mostly rainfall, for example? And did they all change in the same way in those years, or did they change differently in the different years? Sorry, that's a lot of questions. But
yeah, so the first one, the critical slowing down. So what we're looking at is, if you think within one grid square, if you've got an image of that forest year on year, we're looking to see whether the image next year is correlated to the image from the year before. And you'd always expect some sort of temporal autocorrelation there. That doesn't worry us, the fact that there's temporal autocorrelation. You would always expect that, because it is the same place year on year after all. But you would hope that it's reasonably weak. And when it starts strengthening, so that temporal autocorrelation starts strengthening, it's showing that the dynamics of that system are starting to slow down. And there's a very large body of, even going into lab experiments on population dynamics and so on, which shows that when your temporal autocorrelation starts increasing, the rate at which it's a population in a lab experiment, it extrapolates through to ecosystem at the scales we're doing. The rate at which it recovers from a disturbance starts slowing down, and you just start oscillating a bit slower, but a bit more wildly. And that becomes a precursor to a phase change where you swap from one state into another. So it's got a tremendous, it sounds esoteric. I struggle with it myself, if I'm honest. But there's so much theoretical evidence for that being a good signal of impending phase changes, combined with lab experimental evidence, that I do think it's a real thing and something we should be paying attention to. So that's what we're looking at for that one, is very much that temporal autocorrelation pattern. If temporal autocorrelation is increasing, then it's a sign of weakening resilience. The second one, yeah, I didn't mention what's causing those differences. So firstly, the fact that we get the same species doing something different in different years suggests immediately that we don't really know what's driving the changes in the populations of these species. Obviously, something like a logging gradient seems to be secondary to something else deeper. I have absolutely no idea what that deeper thing might be, because I couldn't pin it onto things like El Nino events. Just didn't seem to be having an impact. There was an extra round of logging which happened in the middle of the project, and so some of our data was before that first round. It was before that second round of logging. Some was during, some was after. Couldn't pin it to the facts. Couldn't pin it to that. Couldn't pin it obviously to any climate thing. So I don't know. And my best guess is that it's just one of those artifacts of a complex system with thousands of species all interacting with each other. And sometimes your populations are high and sometimes they're low. What I don't get, though, with that explanation, what's unsatisfactory to me with that is I don't see why that would generate spurious correlations with logging damage. So somehow I think there's got to be some sort of interaction between that complex set of interactions and logging damage itself to drive those patterns of temporal variability. But it's a weak answer, sorry, because I haven't been able to figure it out.
Oh, Penny? Yeah, go ahead, Penny.
Yeah, hi, Bill. How are you going? Thanks for the talk. That was terrific. Most of restoration in Australia is funded by the carbon market. And so I wanted to know, and this goes back to the beginning of your talk, if there is a relationship. I know that there's a relationship between resilience and biodiversity and ecological function. Can you find a relationship, or have you published on the relationship between carbon sequestration and biodiversity? Or the other way around, actually, more biodiversity, the more carbon sequestration? That's question one. And the other one is, how much do you think this research applies to other forest types? Thanks again for the great talk.
Yeah, thank you. Those are good questions as well. We haven't looked for a diversity carbon link, so I don't know the answer to that question, sorry. The generalization question is it's always a difficult one. Partly it depends on how representative our forest is. And so the place we were working at, it's an experimental area, and because of that, it was full of scientists. Because of that, we know hunting was lower than it would normally be in other places. And in fact, we had big, not arguments, but we had quite strong discussions within the main leadership team of SAFE about whether or not we should do something like controlled hunting. And some people were saying yes, because otherwise you don't know what the fragmentation impact was. And then I would argue that actually go to anywhere in the world and these fragmented forests are hunted. So if we want real world outcomes, we need to leave it to be hunted. But it was unavoidable, just for safety reasons, that when people started chucking pig bombs around, which are incredibly dangerous to our researchers, we had to call in wildlife department. And so something like hunting was lower in that area just because we were there. And so that already reduces how well we can extrapolate our results to other forests. Beyond that, I am convinced, and this is a central assumption on virtual ecosystem, that forests of the world are more similar than we think in terms of their dynamics. So you go from Borneo to the Amazon, you go from Borneo to a forest in North America. The species might change, but the functional groups don't really. You still have insect predators, you still have vertebrate predators, you still have primary, early successional plants and late successional plants, and the traits of an early successional plant in the Amazon is pretty similar to an early successional plant in Borneo. The traits of the species are more or less the same anywhere in the world, not just tropical forests, temperate forests as well. And given that I think it's those connections between functional groups which are really determining the dynamics of the forest, then I think results from one forest, by and large, if you're working at that level, should be quite robust to work in other forests. I can't prove that. That's gut instinct more than anything. But I think we can get more value out of site-specific studies, more general value out of site-specific studies than many people assume. I think just because fundamentally the way forests work is the same everywhere.
Thank you.
All right. With that, yeah, probably about time to pull the ripcord on this. But Rob, thank you very much. There was a huge amount of food for thought there. And I was really happy because I think you synthesized a lot of stuff across this massive SAFE project, which has involved obviously lots of different taxa, lots of different people working on it. And anyway, it's great to see that being so successful. And thank you very much, Rob. We'll be in touch about visiting a little bit later on. But yeah, thank you. And thanks very much, Rob. Please join me. Thank you.